The Luftwaffe fights today on many fronts, from the Arctic Circle to the Bay of Biscay and the North African desert, from far out over the Atlantic Ocean to the Volga. But we are not alone. The skies are illuminated by the different national colors of other peoples who share our epic struggle for the common defense of European civilization. Hermann Göring, February 2nd, 1943. Although countless books and magazine articles describe virtually every aspect of German air power in World War II, their millions of readers are mostly unaware that the Luftwaffe fought in concert with a broad variety of foreign air forces across Europe and Asia. Benito Mussolini's partnership with the Third Reich is well known, but his Regia Aeronautica is usually dismissed as having been too weak and ineffectual for interest. So too, Japan's contribution to the Axis is popularly understood. Although beyond common familiarity with the carrier-based attack on Pearl Harbor and the Zero fighter plane's enduring reputation, little is discussed, even among serious students of the Pacific War, about the Imperial Japanese Army or Naval Air Force's regional allies who participated, often decisively so, in the conflict. A general lack of appreciation for their significance stems from the pitifully few books and documentaries devoted to the air arms of either Fascist Italy or Imperial Japan. Far fewer books even go so far as to mention the contemporaneous air forces of Spain, Vichy France or Hungary, to say nothing of Slovakia, Thailand and Manchuria. Nor were the air forces operated by these and other Axis nations the minuscule, insignificant military services you may assume. Close examination of their histories uncovers a largely undisclosed or ignored narrative which puts the conflict into greater context. A book that does bridge this gap is The Axis Air Forces, Flying in Support of the German Luftwaffe by Frank Joseph. In it, he describes and documents the oftentimes strange alliances between the powers of fascism and the various satellite states that surrounded them, each with their own interests and reasons for participating in the war on the side of the Axis. The greater tendency among those interested in World War II is to consider it largely a conflict between Italy, Germany and Japan against the Soviet Union, Britain and America. That is, after all, where most contemporary discussion on the conflict places the heaviest emphasis, with a particular bias towards the contributions of America to the final victory. It can therefore be shocking for some to discover that numerous United States Army Air Force prisoners of war volunteered for service in the Luftwaffe to fight alongside them in what they saw as the real enemy, that of Soviet communism, a position that, ironically, they would later be vindicated for, with the new enemy of the victorious Western Allies becoming the Soviet behemoth in the East, which they helped to foment. The Lend-Lease Agreement is what kick-started Soviet industry following the Revolutionary War, which had seen Russia fall behind its Western allies in production and manufacturing capacity. By war's end, it would rival all of the West combined. Even General George Patton, perhaps America's most famous general, stated at the end of hostilities, "We may have been fighting the wrong enemy all along, but while we're here on the Soviet border, we should go after the bastards now, because we're going to have to fight them eventually." Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army by Eisenhower just after the end of the war for stating this publicly, and he died later in mysterious circumstances. The most famous of these United States Air Force defectors was Second Lieutenant Martin James Monty, who on October 13, 1944, flew a Lockheed Lightning from the 354th Air Service Squadron, stationed at Pomigliano Airfield, north of Naples, to Milan, capital of the Duce's new fascist state, the Italian Social Republic. He pledged both his warplane and personal services to the Axis war against Communist Russia, but German authorities took more interest in the F-5A, an upgraded reconnaissance version of the P-38G, in which Monty arrived, sending it to Germany's Rechlin testing center for evaluation. When his application to join the Luftwaffe was turned down, he enlisted in the SS Standarte Kurt Eggers, a propaganda arm of the Waffen-SS in Berlin, rising to the rank of Untersturmführer. During April 1945, Martin Monty was still wearing his SS uniform when arrested in northern Italy by communist partisans. They turned him over to American military authorities, who thereafter sentenced their former second lieutenant to 15 years imprisonment for desertion, but granted him a pardon several months later, on the condition that he join the US Army. Following promotion to sergeant, he was arrested again in 1948, condemned this time to 25 years incarceration on charges of treason, but paroled in 1960. He died 40 years later in his Florida home. Most are familiar with the Soviet Night Witches Squadron, who were responsible for nighttime harassment sorties behind enemy lines, flying a rickety biplane that the Germans referred to as a sewing machine. These U-2 biplanes would buzz German positions in the dead of night, keeping them from their rest and fraying their nerves already worn thin by stressful combat conditions. A U-2 typically came in less than 50 feet above the ground, made a steep climb just before the enemy camp, then leveled off and cut its engine to glide in on the target. All that the sleep-deprived Germans could do was listen to the ghostly whistling of the wind in the biplane's wire bracing as prelude to an explosion. After the intruders dropped their bombs, they gunned the engine and sped away, usually with impunity. They caused rare material damage almost entirely by chance, but their impact on the invaders' mental well-being was significant. What most are not familiar with, however, is that the U-2 was flown on the side of the Axis by Russian pilots against Stalin's Soviet regime. Russians had been volunteering for German service as early as Operation Barbarossa, but it wasn't until December of 1943 that the Ostfliegerstaffel Russisch was formed entirely of ex-Red Air Force Russian volunteers. Under Luftwaffe direction, the concept of psychological terror bombing, as performed by the Night Witches, was transformed into actual tactical bombing duties that were intended to inflict strategic damage to important military targets, in addition to the psychological effects the low-level night raids produced. These Russian Luftwaffe pilots were naturally familiar with the Kukuruznik and used it effectively in no less than 500 sorties, which they carried out against their fellow countrymen still fighting for Soviet Russia. Russian Luftwaffe volunteers assumed a wide variety of roles, from mechanics and flak gunners to truck drivers and flight instructors. Russian pilots were entrusted with particularly important tasks, such as ferrying aircraft from repair shops behind the lines and even ferrying freshly produced aircraft from the Messerschmitt plants inside the Reich itself directly to frontline operational Geschwader units. By August 1942, so many ex-Soviet airmen had put themselves at the Luftwaffe's disposal, they formed a unit with the express purpose of creating a new Russian Air Force aimed at fighting the USSR. Theoretical training began at once, and many Wehrmacht officers became impassioned champions of the proposal. They argued that the Russians proved themselves trustworthy and dutiful. In the hands of these enthusiastic and motivated volunteers, the 1,500 serviceable Red Army aircraft captured by the Germans during the first year of their campaign could help offset the enemy's terrible numerical advantage. Russian participation on so significant a scale ran against Hitler's post-war plan to colonize the Ukraine for the permanent relief of Europe's food crisis and overpopulation. Obtaining this living space would not be possible in the face of justifiable objections made by too many Russians who helped win the war. But all dreams of Lebensraum evaporated in Germany's steady retreat from crushing defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, until a confidant of the Führer's inner circle decided that the Russian volunteers should be mobilized after all. On September 16, 1944, Reichsführer der SS Heinrich Himmler officially recognized the Ustskaya Osvoboditelnaya Armia, the independent Russian Liberation Army, and its National Air Force, which operated separately from, but in close cooperation with, the Luftwaffe. As some measure of the high esteem in which the Germans held their new ally, select pilots were put through familiarization courses with the top-secret Messerschmitt Me-262 Sternvogel for the creation of an all-Russian jet fighter unit. This plan, however, plus months of necessary training, equipping and organizing, came too late. At the time of their deployment, 17 days before Hitler's suicide, pilots of Fighter Squadron 5 Kazakov and their Focke-Wulf FW-190s, decorated with the Russkaya Osvoboditelnaya Armia insignia of a blue cross in a white disc on a red shield, vainly, if not gallantly, opposed Soviet hordes crossing the Oder. What impact they might have had on the course of events in the East, had they been mobilized earlier, remains one of the persistent speculations of World War II. Nor were they the only Eastern Bloc people who served in the Luftwaffe. More than 1,000 Galician Ukrainians volunteered for ground personnel duty with the Luftwaffe. When they turned 18, some transferred to engine mechanics school, labor battalions for airfield maintenance or medical corps. Beginning after New Year's 1943, Ukrainians with language skills attended translator courses in German, Russian and English at Prague. They graduated as officers with their own Luftwaffe uniforms, including ceremonial daggers, and a special cuff title emblazoned with the country's blue-gold national colors and the word Dolmetsch for translator. Eastern Europeans with extraordinary physical and intellectual abilities were eligible for flight training, and some became exceptional pilots in the Luftwaffe. Paul Pianchuk flew 31 combat missions against the Soviets, and Ivan Sushko, together with several other Ukrainian fighter pilots, received the Iron Cross First Class. Serafima Sitnik, a former Ukrainian major in the Red Air Force, was the only female pilot in the German Air Force serving at the front. Anton Kivskich became a wing leader, but the highest-ranking officer of his kind was Major Severin Sapran, who commanded all Ukrainians in the Luftwaffe. They were distinguished by a blue-gold shield sewn on the shoulder sleeve, signifying the Ukraianske Vyzvolnisko, or Ukrainian Liberation Army, which numbered 80,000 volunteers by war's end. Earlier, many Ukrainians had enlisted in the air arm of the Komitet Obrony Narodov-Rossi, or Army for a Free Russia, created by the former Red Army General Andrei Andreevich Vlasov, to unite all former Soviet-dominated nations against the USSR. Although 20 Ukrainian flight officers signed a petition to Hermann Göring requesting the formation of a separate all-Ukrainian fighter squadron. The Luftwaffe chief regarded them so highly, he assigned Pavel Olejnik to command an all-jet unit of Messerschmitt Me-262 Stormvogels for the defense of Berlin. But their operational life was cut short by the close of hostilities in early May. By the time Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, the Romanian Air Force fielded 253 warplanes in 17 fighter squadrons and 16 reconnaissance squadrons. 14 bomber squadrons were a mixed bag of woefully outdated hand-me-downs from a dozen foreign air forces, plus 40 aging Junkers Ju-87B2 Stuka dive bombers received from Germany the year before. All Romanian aircraft participating in the Eastern Campaign belonged to the Gruperia Ariana de Lupta, but those directly involved in combat operations were combined in their own unit as the Corporal Aryan Roman. The Romanian Air Corps, however, several dozen machines were either undergoing conversion or being repaired, allowing only 205 warplanes available for actual combat. Like all Axis aircraft participating in the opening phase of Barbarossa, their engine cowlings were painted bright yellow. An identically colored band encircled the rear fuselage and covered the underside wingtips for recognition purposes. One of these newly adorned warplanes was flown the second day of the campaign by Lieutenant Igorici Horia in company with 7 other Hawker Mark I Hurricanes of the 53rd Fighter Squadron patrolling the Black Sea port city of Constanta. Sometime into the flight, oil spewed over his windscreen and he returned to the airfield. While mechanics attended to a ruptured gasket, air raid sirens announced the approach of Soviet bombers. Horia jumped back into the cockpit and cranked up the Hurricane's unrepaired 1,030 horsepower Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. At 6,000 feet, he closed on the lead intruder, an Ilyushin DB-3. Squinting through the oil rising again over his windscreen, he surprised the medium bomber to squeeze off an accurate burst from his 8.303 Browning machine guns. One of his target's twin 950 horsepower Nazarov M87 radial engines was abruptly consumed in fire, sending the Ilyushin out of control and into the sea. Defensive fire from another DB-3's machine guns and 20mm cannon could not save the Romanian lieutenant's second victim from crash landing outside Constanta, where its crew was taken prisoner. The third bomber turned away and fled, but Horia took up the pursuit and shot it down in flames. Unnerved by these swift kills, Ilyushin pilots of another incoming formation aborted their attack and circled back into the east. After Horia was able to land his oil-coated Hurricane, he was awarded the Virtutia Aeronautica Order Gold Cross. Before the year was out, he rose to the status of ace by destroying 2 more Soviet aircraft. He was flying an IR-80 with the 58th Fighter Squadron on April 4, 1944, when he claimed a B-24 Liberator of the 15th Air Force, and went on to survive the war with 10 confirmed plus 2 probable kills. During these first few months of Operation Barbarossa, the Romanian Air Force's most successful fighter squadron had been Escadrilla 53 Vanatur. Its pilots flew only Hawker Hurricanes, with which they accounted for nearly 100 enemy warplanes for the loss of just 1 comrade, 5-kill ace, Captain Ioan Răzescu before Odessa fell. Their prominence was something of an embarrassment to Hermann Göring, who learned that a British-built fighter had outperformed Germany's own Heinkel 112 in the hands of the Reich's allies. Accordingly, he immediately donated specimens of the more up-to-date Messerschmitt 109E to Romanian fighter squadrons, whose pilots were to prove that his Emil could indeed surpass the Hawker Hurricane in combat. On July 12, 1941, the Red Army mounted a powerful counteroffensive to cut off Romanian forces battling for Bessarabia. As an immediate response, Romanian Air Force commanders ordered into the air 59 bombers, mostly Italian and Polish hand-me-downs, covered by 54 IAR-80s, Heinkel 112s, Hawker Hurricanes, Fiat Falcons, and PZLP-11s. This mixed assortment armada swept the Soviets from the skies. Then decimated enemy artillery, troops, transports and tanks gathering in large numbers east of the Falciu bridgehead. The bombing and strafing were unrelenting, and the desperation of the fighting was exemplified by the Vanatori themselves. After expending all ammunition from his IAR-80's twin machine guns, destroying 3 of the 6 Ratas attacking him, 2nd Lieutenant Vasile Claru rammed an I-16 flown by Lieutenant Ilya M. Shamanov, a Soviet deputy squadron commander. Neither man survived the collision. On the ground, the Red Army counteroffensive had been reduced to a smoldering salvage dump. By July 26, 1941, the Romanian Air Force established air supremacy over Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, having flown 5,100 missions at the cost of 58 aircraft shot down and 18 pilots killed. Against these losses, the Vanatori destroyed 88 enemy warplanes in aerial combat, together with another 108 on the ground, plus 59 brought down by flak. Romanian anti-aircraft gunners were among the deadliest of World War II, a reputation they would reinforce later in defending the Ploiești oil fields against United States Army Air Force bombers. Elsewhere, however, the Romanians were badly outnumbered in the air, as they would be for the rest of the war. Fresh from their victories in Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, Romanian Air Force crews supported the Romanian Fourth Army's struggle for Odessa, the Black Sea's primary harbor and communications facility. Stalin insisted that this vitally important center must not fall under any circumstances, but Axis commanders were no less determined to take it. As affirmed by the massive artillery barrage they hurled at the fortified city on August 8th, the defenders continued to hold out for more than a month, waiting for a promised Soviet counter-offensive that would break the siege. It came during the night of September 21st when Red Army troops established a bridgehead at Chebanka-Grigorievka, from which they were about to attack the Romanian Fourth Army's weaker right flank. Before they could move, 32 Romanian Air Force bombers escorted by 62 fighters, supplemented by another 23 Italian warplanes of the Regia Aeronautica, dove down on the Soviet Serpent as it was about to strike. After 10 hours of non-stop bombing and strafing, the Red Army bridgehead was pulverized, and Stalin's counter-offensive turned into a demoralized withdrawal. More than 20 Russian aircraft had been destroyed for the loss of a single Romanian fighter in aerial combat, plus 4 more to ground fire. Odessa managed to hang on for another 3 weeks, but its capture on October 16th represented Romania's greatest conquest of the war.